Hi, everybody. This is David Rivas. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Luis Reyes Galindo. But before I do that, just a couple of words on Data Then and Now. This is our second talk this quarter, the third that we've done online. And so thank you all for attending that. Just a note on what Data Then and Now is. So it's a collaboration between eScience Institute, the Data Science Institute at University of Washington, the Information School, Human-Centered Design and Engineering, and the STS program. We have the goal of bringing together in the same venues people who are doing data science or scientists working with high throughput data in the same room with people who do cultural, historical, critical, organizational work on the transformations occurring around data science and datafication more generally. We have two more talks in this quarter. I encourage you to go online and check them out in 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks again for our final. Let me introduce Luis, our speaker, Luis Reyes Galindo. Luis, thank you so much for coming and joining us. We're all really excited about this. Luis is an independent scholar living in Mexico right now. He's also an honorary fellow at Cardiff University School of Social Science. And he is a founding editorial member for a new STS journal called Tabuya, if I'm saying that right, Science and Technology in Latin America. A lot of his Luis's work focuses on bringing sociological understandings to the activities of scientists. He's done work in the past on demarcating between fringe and mainstream science. Today, he's going to talk to us about outsider interpretations of open scientific data and their impact on policy. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Luis.
Oh, well, thank you for the invitation. It's a bit strange just to be speaking to a computer. I can't see you. I usually walk around a lot when I'm presenting, so it feels strange to just be sitting down. But we'll manage, I think. Now, before I start, I have to tell you, I'm going to tell you a story to begin the talk. It's a very interesting story. I think it's one of the most fascinating stories of really contemporary science. Unfortunately, I'll have to give you a very, very abridged version of it. As with most stories in physics that people know about, it starts with Einstein. And the photograph that you're seeing on your screen is one of his first notebooks where he develops the ideas behind general relativity and the maths, of course. Now, what is general relativity? I'll have to say to you in 1 minute, which is a bit hard. But basically, it's a theory about how mass changes space-time. Now, what does that mean? This is usually the picture that science popularization shows. And it just means that wherever there's a mass anywhere in space, this will distort the way that space and time itself behave to certain observers. So one of the ways that you can see that is how light behaves near mass. And it turns out that it behaves differently as if mass weren't there. And that's basically what general relativity does. It describes mathematically and conceptually how that happens. So there's all sorts of strange effects that I can't, unfortunately, go into right now. And I'm not a specialist, by the way. I'm a physicist by training, but this is an area that is not really my strongest expertise. But anyway, this is another one of his notebooks and a manuscript. And what he does here is to think about one thing. If you look at this picture, I'm going back a little bit. It looks quite static, I think. So, and yes, indeed, if this was a mass, these were two masses that just weren't moving, nothing was happening to them particularly strong, it would remain like this. Now, what Einstein discusses in this manuscript is invites us to think about what would happen if this were not a static picture, but a dynamic picture. So what if these things were like moving, or masses were appearing, or they were interacting? And what he concludes is that this distortion of space and time, whatever that means for now, would create a wave. So it wouldn't be just a local effect or a static effect, as in the picture I showed before, but something that moves. So like sound moves, and it's a wave of compressions in the air. Well, these distortions of time and space will also move. Now, even then, when in this manuscript, when Einstein starts working out the maths and what this actually means and what this would look like, how to detect this, because how do you detect something as strange sounding as a distortion of space and time? He realized that there were, of course, physical effects that you could measure, but they were really, really small. So when working out the equations, it turns out that something really big at a galactic scale, or a planetary scale at least, has to happen for these waves, these distortions of space and time that move across space. What needs to happen? And even Einstein said, I think this is a real effect. My math says it's a real effect, but it's unlikely that we'll ever be able to measure it because the changes are just so small and so hard to measure. The first half of my talk, what I'll be doing is to talk a little bit about the sociology behind the detection of these waves. These waves have actually been detected. The 2019 Nobel Prize went to people that actually did detect this after about a century after Einstein predicted it. And the man in this picture that I'm showing here is Harry Collins. He was my PhD supervisor. He's been hanging out with the scientists that were trying to detect these, now we can call them gravitational waves, for I think some 40 years. So what he does is he goes and he talks to them. Well, what we as sociologists of science do a lot. Just, interview them, but also he's at their meetings. He's written 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 books about this, which I highly recommend. Everyone who's in SCS will have known Changing Order at least, which is just a book generally about the sociology of science. This one, The Traveling at the Speed of Thought, is one of my favorite SCS books. That's more about the theoretical development of gravitational wave physics. Gravity's Shadow is an interesting book, but it's far too long for my taste. It's about 900,000 pages long, I can't remember it. And it goes into really, really detailed description of how the field of gravitational wave detection grew up, and went into the modern era, where things get interesting, and where they'll actually touch on this talk is Gravity's Ghost and Big Dog and Gravity's Kiss, which is about the experiment that I'm going to tell you about. And I think it's as detailed as Gravity's Shadow, but it's a much shorter time period. And anyway, Harry and I had a lot of talks about the sociology of physics. I was never particularly interested in gravitational waves because it's the experimental side of physics, and I'm working more on the theoretical side, like Dan Kempf. But anyway, a few months ago, I came across an episode that I thought was very interesting. Now, this is the actual apparatus that is used to detect gravitational waves, and that tried to detect gravitational waves for 20 years. There were various iterations of it. As you can see, it's 2 arms, which are 4 kilometers long. So this is a huge apparatus. And what it is basically an interferometer. And the idea of interferometer is probably one of the basic ideas of experimental physics. What happens, as you can see in the picture, you've got something like a black hole, which produces a very strong distortion in space-time, like in the picture of the sun, much harder, a much stronger effect. And as you can see, there's not just one, but there's 2 black holes. Now, this is quite contemporary physics from the second half of the 20th century. we're, at some point we weren't even sure that black holes existed. But anyway, they say, what happened? Somebody said, theoreticians said, what happens if you have two black holes and then they're very close to each other and they're spinning? Well, it turns out that they will collapse. And this can happen not just with black holes, but with a lot of astronomical scale objects, very massive objects like planets or pulsars or whatever. If they're very close to each other, they'll collapse, and there will be a huge, huge wave of gravitational waves coming out. And there you can see, the distortions of space-time stretching out and just carrying those distortions far, far away. These things are, of course, very far away from the Earth, which is part of the exciting thing. Anyway, so these distortions of space-time just spread out like a wave. At some point in time, they hit the Earth, and they hit these huge apparatuses. And these two arms, it turns out that if you go through the physics, these two arms stretch and contract as the wave passes. Now, they're built in such a way that one of the arms stretches while the other contracts. And you can actually measure this. And this is what an interferometer does. It just sends out a signal, a light signal, laser signal, across the arms. It's bounced from mirror, it comes back, and then it's kind of mixed again in the center where it came from. And it turns out that if you do this, you can get a signal, a definite signal of when the contraction is and the shrinking is going on. And this is the idea behind LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. And this is how actually they detect gravitational waves. Now, the thing that's interesting about LIGO, and which I'll go through very briefly, is that the signals you can get from the stretching and contraction of time and space are really quite small, as Einstein predicted. So here's, just for illustration purposes, is a graph of the noise that is always happening in the detector versus the signal. So the noise is the signal in red in the graph, and the blue is the actual signal from gravitational waves. The magnitude that you would get from such a big event as the collapse of two black holes. As you can see, it's tiny. In fact, it sort of looks like magic that from all this noise, you can extract a signal, and it really is quite like magic. Now, where does this noise come from? Well, the detector is so prone to a lot of physical effects that, because it's that word. Anyway, the point is that if you, for example, if one big problem with LIGO was seismic noise. So an earthquake, even small earthquakes, not huge earthquakes, just the moving of the earth, maybe because a truck passed by, or even an airplane, can shake the ground so much that the signal that you'll get from that is much bigger than the gravity waves. And there's all these effects that underneath that they tell you where this noise comes from. So something as silly as a plane passing by will definitely bring in noise into the apparatus. Let me see what else can I tell you about this that I haven't told you. Oh, it will pop up. Now, this is a nice graph. This is what these spinning and crashing black holes would look like. They actually spiral each other, so that's the kind of motion that they do. They send out gravity waves, and then this is the part that I'll have to be very brief about, because I could just spend the whole talk referring to this. But the first detection that LIGO came up with, after 20 years of different versions of this apparatus, was done on September 14th, 2015. This was a huge event. This was a huge event. The gravitational wave community and the LIGO collaboration right now is made up of 1,000 something scientists. So they're all working on this same experiment. So, you know, they haven't been able to detect these gravitational waves for LIGO for over 20 years, but people have been trying to detect this for almost 40 years. If you want the full story, you can read Gravity's Wave. So, you know, when after 100 years of being predicted by Einstein, and then 40 years of negative experiments, negative, you know, no detections basically, and then 20 years of this really, really expensive, complex experiment, not detecting anything, people still believing that, no, this is a real effect. We should be able to detect this. To get this first detection was a huge thing. This, by the way, the process of detection, as I said, is in Big Dog book, but that's not the part that I'm interested in. So, what happens? This detection is made. People get very excited. You know, everybody knew that this, if this was ever done, this was absolutely for certain Nobel Prize. And in fact, they did award in 2017. Sorry, I think I said 2019. Nobel Prize in Physics. Gravity's Kiss, the book that I'm showing right now, which is important for the rest of the talk. What he does is what Harry Collins does is to describe how the experiment went from, you know, getting this signal in a detector that meant that something had been detected that looked like gravitational waves, to the actual writing of the paper. So it's a bit of an autoethnography of a sociologist who knows the physics, not the conceptual side of physics, not technical side of physics, and is always present there. So, you know, you get a real feeling of how the Nobel Prize paper, the one that gave, was the reason for awarding the Nobel Prize, how that gets written up. And one of the things that Harry has always remarked about this community is that they're extremely, sometimes ridiculously careful of checking everything that they do within the experiment and how they describe it. You know, that starts that's basically in all of his books, but particularly in the last two. You know, you get this insider view of how, you know, sometimes they're neurotic. At some points, even Harry says, you know, I was there and I was just thinking, you know, how can they be so detailed and so careful? You know, they should just go out and say that they've done this and not hesitate so much. People thought that after getting a strong enough signal to detect gravitational wave detection, that it would take around 3 months to go through all the protocols that they had for actually, you know, claiming that this was a detection, because it's such a complex experiment, such a small effect. You know, a lot of things have to be done before you're really sure that you've measured something and it's not just noise. There's a whole book about that, literally. And then, you know, when they're writing up the papers, like, okay, we agree that this effect is real. Well, how do we put that out? Well, you know, these guys are like, you know, first of all, there's 1,000 of them. You know, 1,000 giving their opinions and saying, well, you should do this and you should do this. We shouldn't. Some people, for example, didn't say that when they wrote the paper, they should use the word detection, because they should direct detection, because, you know, what does direct detection mean about an effect that comes from something that you can't see? You literally can't see black holes, so you can't really get a visual confirmation through telescopes. And then that is, you know, this really tiny signal that hits this very complex detector, and that moves a needle that doesn't really have to do directly with the gravitational wave, but its effect on the light that's traveling. Now, that's not really direct detection. Gravitational waves, you know, there was evidence for gravitational waves existing, but it was very indirect way of not seeing them, but the effects they had on certain astrophysical systems. So this is as close as you really can expect to get to direct detection of something this complex. Well, you know, there's a whole chapter about why call it direct or not call it direct detection. So Anyway, the Nobel Prize is awarded. Everybody knew that it was going to be awarded to LIGO after they wrote the paper that I'm talking about, which is published in Physical Review Letters. The Nobel Prize can only be awarded to 3 people each year. So, you know, when the announcement came out, the Nobel Prize was awarded to these 3 men. Barry Barish was very important in setting up you know, the managerial side of the experiments. As I said, these experiments involve hundreds of people, so that is a real accomplishment. Kip Thorne is the theoretician that first described these black holes. You know, in the end, what was detected were 2 black holes spinning around each other in spiral, it's called, and then clashing and merging. Well, Kip Thorne was the first person to describe that theoretically, and Rainer Weiss was the man that was behind a lot of the technology that was eventually would be applied and would become LIGO. So, you know, they're very important names in the field. But, you know, why award them to these 3 when there were 1,000 people involved in the experiment? Well, that's just a Nobel Prize. Actually, I think it was Barry Barish that said that he was very disappointed that they hadn't actually given it to the collaboration, because it was really a collaborative effort. So the paper comes out, and Nobel Prize awarded, quite fast as things go. And, you know, it's good. Harry actually told me once that, you know, he was very sad that, and he says it in his books, you know, it was very sad that they'd actually finally, after so many years, detected gravitational waves, because now this is not interesting to me anymore. You know, sociology of science, and particularly from Harry's generation, was always very interested in controversies. That's where Harry made his name. And, you know, up to this, there have been a lot of things that were exciting to describe from that point of view. You know, all the fights there were about which technology to choose, which not, even about detection itself. So Harry talked a lot about, you know, the first efforts to detect these things and how they cause incredible controversies. And then finally they detect something, and he says, like, you know, now it's just going to be normal science. Now it's just going to be all boring everyday science. Not really that boring, because what the LIGO result showed was that you actually could detect these things, and, you know, the technology is there, so we can build a lot of LIGOs, and with this we can see things that we had never been able to see before. See, of course, in this kind of metaphorical sense. But, you know, certainly this, if you get a real gravitational wave observatory as such, well, you can build others, and then, you know, that was understood to open up a whole new field in astronomy where you could detect things that you had never been able to detect before. But Harry just said, you know, that's like normal science, and I'm really more interested in controversial science or things like that. So, you know, he said, this is the last book I write about gravitational waves. I'm not sure that's going to be the case. And, you know, that was it. Now, what happens? In November of 2018, New Scientist, which is quite a well-respected scientific news magazine, puts out this report, special investigations. Did we really find gravitational waves? And I'm sure that the people at New Scientist didn't really do anything, but breakthrough physics result questioned. And, you know, they if you look at this paper, they actually say, you know, there's strong, somebody came up with strong reasons to doubt whether these gravitational waves were really detected. It was a Danish group, they were not actually gravitational wave scientists, but they were, it was a group that was very much interested in signal processing and that data processing, and they had a lot of experience in this. So, you know, these weren't just any sort of scientists. They were scientists outside the field of gravitational wave physics, but very good at data processing. And what they did was they looked at LIGO data, which was, by then it was already online, part of it. And that's the graphs. This is taken from that New Scientist paper. The top graph is the actual supposedly, signal where the gravitational waves were detected. And the part in gray is the one that points to there being gravitational wave, not just noise. As I said, it's very hard to extract the noise from the signal from the noise. But that was the illustration that they put out in that prize-winning paper. What you can see there is two lines. One, well, I forgot to say this. That's what I forgot to say a bit later. But you remember that there were two pictures of the detector. It's actually two detectors. They use two detectors to catch these gravitational waves. One is in Hanford, one's in Livingston, both in the US. They're a few miles apart for technical reasons. And the idea is that, if they both see this signal at the same time, then they can be sure that it's a gravitational wave and not just noise. And the way that they do it is SSX. The idea is simple, but the process is actually quite complex. These Danish scientists look at this data, and they process it with their own techniques, and they said, look, we actually don't see this correlation, this signal as easily as you do. In fact, if after we do our analysis and follow your instructions, we think that you can't really claim that this is a signal. This may actually be noise. Now, interestingly, they don't say that, they don't go as far as say, did we really find gravitational waves? What they say is much more modest. This, this exactly kind of this argument. We're very good at processing data. We've looked at your data, the data that you've put out on the internet. And when we do our analysis, we get this thing, which is kind of strange. So, maybe you should improve your techniques. We don't doubt that you found gravitational waves, but we do doubt a little bit, or significantly, your statistical treatment of the data. Then eScience goes and explodes it into this, should we really have awarded like the Nobel Prize? This is where actually my analysis starts. I went through all the news, popular science news and some special science news. This after the report came out about the signal not being real. There was a lot of attention from the press, and the interesting thing here is that this exploded from being a sort of small technical detail from outsiders. This is where the title of the talks comes in, to something really actually saying no. This is Sabine Hausenfelder, she's a physicist who has a very popular blog amongst physicists, a very good blog. If you're ever interested in knowing what's happening in physics and you want a bit of more technical detail, go to her blog, Back Reaction. She says, this is a Nobel-worthy discovery and much is at stake. So even the smallest doubt that something is at odds should be erased. Talking about the Danish group's investigation. Now, as I said, there's Sabine. LIGO had a very strange response to this. I think it's very strange because instead of, telling a Harry-like story of like, look, what you saw in our paper was just a very small part of what we did. We're very careful about what we do. We're really, really quite careful. And the statistical treatment of the noise versus signal data was, it was being scrutinized by literally hundreds of scientists. Some of the people that I interviewed when I was doing my PhD at Cardiff were people from the data analysis group. And, they said, we specialize just in this. LIGO, because of its very nature and its size, it's a very fragmented experiment. So there's the people at the site, the one that actually operate the detector. They create the data. It's a lot of data. And then that data is sent to the data analysis team, or the data analysis teams, because there's quite a few. And then they look at it and it goes on to another team. So it's quite complex. And you know, they are very careful. Again, if you read Harry's account, the feeling you get is they're too careful. So, you know, for somebody to come out and say, we really highly doubt that you're doing good statistical treatment is quite strong. But anyway, the way that the Danish group said in the beginning, I think was rather uncontroversial. Just you know, we get this strange effect. Why don't you look at it? And I wanted to show this. This is the first response that came from the LIGO Scientific Collaboration spokesperson. The interesting thing is if we zoom in here, it says, we are paying a peer review that explains this controversy. So, you know, don't worry, we are able to answer this. The Nobel Prize was real. And then this is the interesting part that I want to concentrate on. Science thrives on skepticism and on desire to understand deeply how a result has been obtained. No doubt. I mean, internally, there were always, you know, there were always skeptics about the results. The whole history of the sociology of gravitational waves is to record this, to show how skepticism inside the groups create knowledge. And you know, the claims between the LIGO scientists themselves are put to the test. Some of them work, some of them don't. Yes, there's a lot of skepticism. But it's strange because, you know, every time that this, not every time, but a lot of scientists, and a lot of physicists particularly, when they talk about their science, they go on about the skepticism. You know, the important thing in science is skepticism. And what we see, let me go on because, I just want to point that out. Now, this is where the other side of the talk comes in. You know, the Danish group took their data from the LIGO Open Science Center. It's a webpage where you can get supposedly all the data that LIGO has manufactured across many years, and you can check that for yourself. They've got a data plan, which is actually quite a complex document. I don't know, I can't remember exactly, but it's like 10 pages long of, you know, how we should put out data. And one of the things that they say in the data management plan is that, you know, if you're going to use this data, you should be able to understand the information without needing the assistance of the experts who produce the information. Now, it makes a bit of sense. You know, we put out our data. Yes, we can help you out, but it is that you do this yourself. What's happening here with the Danish group is people who are actually very knowledgeable about statistical techniques and physics itself, maybe not that kind of physics, but, you know, physics that are close by, are getting things wrong according to LIGO. So, you know, they're actually showing that the data management plan is asking a bit too much. The controversy exploded. And again, I can't go into too many details of how that worked out. But, you know, there were theoreticians who analyzed the Danish group's results. Papers came out that said, no, well, you know, you're doing this a bit wrong. And, you know, the Danish group to date says that LIGO did something wrong. There have been attempts to dialogue with them, but I think they're not really that good. The people at LIGO just basically said, well, we'll just ignore you because we're sure that what we've done. And then after that, they started putting out this, and this is what I'm showing right now is the data usage notes from that Open Science webpage. And when you go into the webpage, you know, it says, please read this first. So before you start using our data, we need you to understand all of these things which are on your screen right now. You know, so you have to understand what, you know, how LIGO works. You have to understand the upgrades that went through, the positions. There's something called injections, which are tests that they do to see if their statistical analysis are correct. All sorts of things. If you actually, I mean, if you go into the finer details, into links that this webpage includes, you get the feeling, well, you know, you basically have to have a PhD in advanced in physics, at least, you know, have very advanced knowledge of physics and computer data analysis techniques to understand this. So this is not really meant for all the public. And I think we should read this episode that I just told you about rather fast. I think forces us to think about what is the use of actually putting open data out there. Open data, scientists putting out the data they produce from experiments is something that's very big right now. Of course, most people involved in this area of studies knows that. Since a lot of my work in sociology has gone into open access applications in the last years. This started something like 10 years ago. And then after people said, we should liberate publications in science, we should also release data. And then there's all sorts of conversations, including in policymaking at the highest levels and in science, saying, it's a good practice to actually, if you produce data, put it out there for people to scrutinize. But I think what the LIGO episode forces us to think about is, who can really use this data? So is this something that you're going to give to this sort of scale? It's very informal, but for heuristic purposes, are the public? Anybody can just go into the LIGO webpage and make their analysis? Well, no, clearly not. Maybe not everybody, but perhaps somebody who's interested in gravitational waves. I became interested in gravitational waves because of this a little bit. And I certainly cannot go into the LIGO webpage and use this. So, maybe we should talk about just non-scientists, but, people who are involved in data. So, like data analysts, maybe they can use the LIGO data. Well, not really, because the Danish group is really, I can't say non-scientist practitioners, they're scientists. But, I can easily imagine people that I know who are very good at data analysis not being able to understand what's happening with LIGO data. Is it just scientists, just any scientists? Well, no, not really. I'm a social scientist. I'm a social scientist, and I would not be able to go into this. But I'm also a physicist, so no. That LIGO data is not usable to me. Scientists in that field. So in physics, well, again, no, that applies to me. Well, scientists not just in any field, but in that field, gravitational waves. Well, not exactly. The Danish group were almost there. They were almost in that field. What I think we should say is that who is this most useful to? Where what people in STS call the core set, which is the people that are actually producing this knowledge and have a very intimate knowledge of how the experiment operates, and people from the LIGO community. So it's really a bit ironic. So the only people that can actually use, that would have been able to put the LIGO data to very good use were the people that produce the data. So anyway, this is not something to say. My argument, people might think that what I'm saying is that no, we shouldn't open up our data. No, what we just really need to think about is not just putting out the data, but its usability. And as I said, open is just like a buzzword right now across the world. People talk about it in many ways. Open access, which is the bottom of this diagram that I'm showing you, is what I'm interested in. Do we just put out published results? Do we just open up our research data like LIGO did? Open up everything, to the analysis of our publications. Yeah, this is quite a complex subject, but it really is, an important buzzword in science policy right now. And these things about open citizen science projects are popping up everywhere. And some of them are quite nice, quite neat, and some of them quite useful. So this is the middle picture I'm showing you, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, which is this attempt to create a map of the visible universe from Earth and just make it available for everybody. You can actually use this. Monarch initiatives, so conservation issues. I put that little global big day photo just for Arturo, who's maybe listening right now. He's got a PhD project on citizen science and bird watchers. So the idea is to get people involved in science and for this purpose of data analysis, and make science themselves. And this is becoming a huge thing. It's quite big. This is just a small example, but this is from the European Open Science Cloud, which is a big project right now that Europe has. It's going to become European level legislation that says that science actually benefits from having these open data cultures and these open access cultures, but the public also benefits. And there's this whole big tradition of responsibility in research and information, for example, which is responsible research and innovation, which is a branch of STS studies that has had a strong impact on European policy, and that moves along these lines of open science, open data is just a public good. And here they say only considerable cultural change will enable long-term use for science and innovation of data created by research. What they mean is that if you read the whole document, they're putting out like this, once we open up our data, we need a whole change about how we think about data and science to harness the open data and make just incredibly better science, and the public will benefit, everybody will benefit. It's a very positive view of openness. Now I'll just go very quickly through this because, I've, with Harry and other people at Cardiff, we've studied what it means to be an outsider. Now you can see where the word outsider from the title of my talk comes from. Outsiders of the core communities that produce the data, how usable is it? How legitimate are your interpretations of that data? We've studied this in a lot of detail. We had a project, very nice project, 2 projects at Cardiff some time ago. One of the suggested reasons I gave for this talk was about that, where we looked at people that were not in these core sets of science, but that nevertheless tried to impact science. And what you get is that there's actually not a very clear definition about who's inside and who's outside. Now, the LIGO case that I showed you is an extreme case because that has a little bit to do with the nature of physics. But these boundaries are very diffuse. So we looked at this, what we call the fringe of physics, which is these people who claim, for example, to have discovered cold fusion, which were not scientists, they're often engineers. But we also looked at people like some of these guys who are scientists who are not exactly in orthodox science areas, but try to impact it. And what you get is that it's not always very easy to say, well, you're an outsider, so you're a legitimate interpreter of data, and you're not. You're inside. And what we came up with was sociological demarcation. So how can you actually look at these people and say, this is a legitimate way of doing science, in particular of analyzing data that's out there. I just want to point to the very first line, which is, we've got different degrees of science, going from mainstream to very fringy things like astrology. What are their characteristics? How can we tell that this is no longer mainstream science, that really clearly legitimate science? There's many things that we should look about. One of them is primarily oppositional. So this is one characteristic of things that start to look like fringy science and not mainstream science, which is that they always try to oppose established scientific results no matter what. This is a little bit of what the Danish group has become right now, because even though the community of LIGO went through their data and their analysis, they refuse to say that they might be wrong. So they've become a little bit of that fringy side. And the other paper that I suggest give us a suggested reading talks about this. And the core thing, the one that I want you to take away from this is the first line, which is really that outsiders of a scientific community find it very hard to really understand the internal dynamics in this case, of data creation and data analysis. So even if you're somebody who knows and can read the papers, you're not, there's always some things that you're not going to be able to see, and it can lead to very, very strange interpretations, and interpretations that will clash with mainstream science, that you really won't have a good dialogue about. And this is really a paper in the writing, but I think that, you know, we have to think about science in a different way nowadays. We can't go on like, you know, the reason why I showed you that LIGO response email was, again, that thing about skepticism and this obsession with scientists saying that, again, particularly physics, that, you know, the natural scientific attitude is the skeptic attitude. Yes, of course, skepticism has a place in science. It's part of what makes science advance. But, you know, we go back to Kuhn, to Thomas Kuhn about this. Yes, it's one side of science, but it's not the whole story. You also have to tell people, you know, the strength of science also comes from sometimes skepticism being put aside. So, you know, scientists are very bad at doing this. There's always going on about skepticism. If you look at the latest Cosmos series, that's the way that Neil deGrasse Tyson starts it, saying, you know, talking about Galileo and how he was a skeptic, and, you know, that's the spirit of science. I think that's actually not a good thing to do. And particularly, I would like science policymakers to think about this in terms of what we're telling the public. It's actually a lie when policymakers go out and say, you know, this data that we're letting you guys see after it's created by scientists will automatically bring public good. Not really. You know, not public as in the sense of, you know, I'm just an average Joe trying to come to grips and to reanalyze your science. That is essentially a lie. Of course, again, I'm not defending the idea that, you know, open science is bad. No, what we have to think about is exactly the things I'm trying to point out in this slide. And I can make those slides available if anybody wants them. But just, you know, my ending message, I think we're coming up to the end now, is really think about what it means to make legitimate interpretations of data. And it will be very hard for the public to make these interpretations in a way that it creates dialogue with scientists, genuine dialogue. In the case of the Danish group, for example, it did create dialogue. You know, some thorny issues about the LIGO experiments did come out. They were discussed. That was good. But as far more than that, I don't think we can really claim. And I think just this, I end this, because right now we're living through a particularly special time, as everybody knows, where we see that, you know, scientific institutions I'm talking about, not knowledge, no, but institutions being undermined by a lot of political discourse and a lot of actual policy making. And I didn't want to go, you know, I was going to end this the talk with talking about Trump and this Bolsonaro guy. I don't think it's worth it right now. I think what the message that I really want to say, to give to you, is this talk about skepticism in science, which is still recurring between scientists and policymakers, is not helping things. And as I said, I think we can all imagine how, for example, making data open about the efficiency of medical treatment and having people outside with definite political interests use that to undermine science, this would not be very good. You know? Again, I think the strength from science comes both from skepticism, you know, Merton, not quite Merton, but kind of Merton, of organized skepticism versus, you know, conservative attitude, not really conservative, just a normal attitude of science of, you know, this is established result. We should be in this. For policy making, I think that is extremely important. And I just want to thank you. And if you have any questions, etc., that I can't answer right now, you can just write to me and I'll be very happy to do. And thank you.
Thank you, Luis.
Thank you, Luis.
From all of us. All right, at this point, we're going to take a few questions. Feel free, audience out there, to enter your questions into the Q&A input at the bottom, and then we can either read them out or maybe we'll give you direct access. While we wait for some of those questions, we can take a few questions too from the panel if anyone has any up here.
Well, I can see that Arturo was on my move. I'm very glad.
Can I start off? So I've already got a question. Ha ha ha.
I do too. Okay, go.
So Luis, okay, first, lovely talk. I just really enjoyed your storytelling style. I really feel like I understood LIGO in a way that I didn't quite understand it before, and the controversy that I didn't know about. But my question for you is about, so you're talking a lot about outsiders, but I'm actually interested in the concept of the insider that you have. And here's, and so I'll just put it bluntly. I'm not very convinced that there's a clean inside in the way that you're suggesting. And so if we were to take, you described LIGO as a collaboration occurring over 20 years. It will have had engineers and physicists and computer scientists involved. Here's my sense is that there's a great deal of data sharing that would have occurred within this thing that you're calling an inside. That is, that there would have been some people who understand deeply the technicalities of this instrument or that subpart of the instrument, or who understand this statistical operation that we ran, or this cleaning of the data operation that we ran. That data would have been moving around LIGO across many actors, many who would say, right, like one person might be like, this person has no clue how this instrument was developed. This person doesn't understand the statistical operation that I had to run to clean this data. In other words, I suspect that LIGO internally is quite heterogeneous and filled with expertises that don't understand each other. And so, I mean, I guess I want to understand, what are you saying here about this inside of LIGO? It almost sounds like what you're saying is like, the inside understands and the outside doesn't. But I'm skeptical to think that like the inside is like some homogeneous category that understands. I'm also skeptical to think that, I don't know, it kind of almost sounds like if you're not part of LIGO, you have no right to speak to the issues of what occurred within LIGO, even if you're an expert, even if you're a statistical analyst, even if you're an engineer. Can you speak to that?
Yes, well, the first thing I have to say is, yes, LIGO is very, very fragmented. So for example, one of the people that I talked to in Cardiff, Stephen Fairhurst, who's leader of one of the statistical data analysis team, said to me, like, he deals directly with the data that's produced on site. And he gets the raw data as raw as it can get. And he said to me, like, look, you know, we have this thing in LIGO that sometimes I don't know what's happening with the data. You know, I get this data and it doesn't make sense. I do my analysis and I say something must be wrong. You know, something, there's a glitch in the detector. And I call up the guy. It literally says, I call up the guy at the site, and I have no idea what he's talking about. No idea what he's talking about. He talks about channels and blah, blah, blah. And I kind of roughly know, but I don't know where the problem is. So what do they do? This was very interesting conversation, because he said, look, what we do is we produce ambassadors. So I have a PhD student, a postdoc, who, you know, I say to them, just go out and you deal with, you know, you go on site, you talk to the experimental people, and then you come back and tell us what you said. And that's what your PhD is going to be about. So that's one way. And you know, they came up with a lot of ways of how to overcome this fragmentation. This is not unique to LIGO. I have done interviews at CERN. CERN is even more brutal experiment in terms of size than LIGO. LIGO is the organization itself is not as complex as CERN, which has a lot of experiments going on, even experiments that are sometimes, you know, challenging each other. This also happens there, and I talk to data and else people there, and it's exactly the same thing. Exactly. Now, it might sound like I'm saying, no, nobody outside can look at these data. No, they can. But the other thing that's interesting about LIGO is that they do have a lot of coordination at top levels. So even though nobody will know the details of every part of the experiment, everybody knows what they should know. Maybe as data analysts, I don't know the intricate details of the wires that are going on, but I certainly know, at a higher level, what is established. And it all goes back to the issue of trust. I trust what these guys are saying to a large degree. And I know what I should trust. I know that if this guy says, no, you're getting this wrong, I have to take it on board. And this gets at the heart of the matter. This is what an outsider will not know. And this is what, amongst them, Harry, so I have to go back to Harry, a lot of things I know, calls collective tacit knowledge. So things that are not stated, but that you should know, and you can become aware of what that is. So, at some point, the Danish group started challenging things that pretty much nobody in LIGO, except a few people, would have allowed it to be challenged because it was just such an established result. Well, they didn't know. And this is the interesting thing, that what marks it's not, as I said, that these borders are a bit diffuse, but what makes somebody part of the experiment is knowing what they shouldn't challenge. I think that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Right.
I don't know if you can see them. Do you want me to just read them to you, Luis?
I'm going to try to.
Let's see, we've got two. I'll read out first from Lita Barada. Therefore, you are arguing that skepticism in science is important, but it has to be healthy skepticism. That is, skepticism aimed at making sure that science is valid. I do agree that the people who best know their data are those who have worked it for many years. It takes a lot of time to know your data. Closer to a comment, but if you want to respond.
Yes, although what is healthy? Well, I think this also depends on what science you're looking at. And LIGO is an experiment that has been going on and being worked on for, as I said, 20 years. Of course, not all experiments are like that. Not all experiments are that stable or can reach that level of stability. And I think this is also an important part that maybe I didn't stress. It depends which science and which kind of place you're looking at. So, if the community itself admits that this is controversial science, well, then, that, maybe even extreme skepticism should be allowed. But it's the community that says it, not the outsiders. Again, because only if you're outside the community, you get a sense of what is stable and what it means to do healthy skepticism.
Thanks. I'll read the second. Sarah Nelson has a musing question. She's musing at you. Pushes for open data, quote unquote, often seem to develop in physical sciences, where data are typically not about individual human research participants. How or does the insider-outsider distinction transfer to fields like genomics or biomedicine, where data are collected from human research participants and thus may only be available under controlled access? What about when the potential outsider, quote unquote, is the person participant who donated the data? Are they deserving of more accessibility to interpret?
Yes, well, good question, good musing question. There's a reason why both Harry and I think, use these examples from physics very carefully, and we're very careful to say what this says about science in general, what it can say about science in general. Physics is a very strange bird in the world of science. Yes, there's things that in physics are very different to biological science, biomedical sciences. This is one of them. Of course, gravitational waves themselves don't care. Whatever Latour says, they don't care, you know, if you use them for your scientific purposes. Well, you know, that's not true about the biomedical sciences and human subjects. So we know that there, you know, this is just a story that I told you that has a moral that's very constrained. Just let's think about these things concerning open data, and not just take things for granted that open data is always good. But you know what? One of the papers I sent you to read was about how I and a couple of social science people in Cardiff thought about this in terms of the social sciences. We have a lot of experience, I in physics, they mostly in biomedical sciences. And things are very different across each science. We know that as STS people. I guess what I'm trying to say is this is where our skeptical attitude as STS people should come in. Apparently, well, one of the things that worries me is this resonation between the open science movement and the generally participatory democratization of science STS movement. There's very strong resonances, and I think that some things are not being carefully thought about. I just got, I can see the question right now. I mean, just to answer the question itself, I think, yes, you know, people should have access to that data. People should get benefit from that data, concerning human subjects. But how, and you know, I'm not sure. If you ask me, do they have a right to the interpretation of that data? That's a different question. I don't think there's such a clear-cut answer for me to say, yes, they should have a legitimate interpretation as, you know, anybody else. We know that there are STS cases, very well documented cases, the Epstein studies on HIV patients, where, you know, outsiders, what we call outsiders, patients come in and actually impact the science. But they're very special kind of patients. They're patients who Epstein shows acquire a very, very conceptually advanced idea of what the science looks like, and they can actually dialogue with the scientists. And again, you know, if you look at the Epstein story, the patients start to realize what they don't know and what they need to learn to actually have this meaningful dialogue. And that happens with the doctors too. So again, I'm not against data access in any sort of form. I do think that about the interpretation, we do have to be very careful.
There's one more question, but Megan, did you want to ask one?
No, that amusing question actually hit on a lot of what I wanted to ask about. So thank you.
We have one more. We have another question. Perhaps a student of yours, Luis? Is it Arturo Vallejo?
Not my student.
Yeah. He's asking, on your talk today, you focus mainly on the ability of the general public to use open data produced by the core, quote unquote, scientists. But I wonder if there's a way for open data produced by outsiders to be used by the core. If so, by what means or channels? What are the implications? Does that really happen in physics?
No, actually, I think I focus not on the general public, but actually on more specialized sort of scientists. You know, that's what I said about the Danish people. The interesting about them is that they are very good at, you know, the technical details of what goes on behind data analysis and LIGO. But I mean, I get the question. This is something that LIGO was actually forced to think about. I don't think they've thought about it as well as they should. One of the things they do is try to answer this in their open science portal. they're trying to develop like tutorials. They actually have developed tutorials for people who are not part of LIGO, but are interested in these sort of things, to be able to go and manipulate data. But one of the things that they're very careful to say is like, look, this is done for a pedagogical purpose. So, you know, these are simplified data sets. We're telling you what data you should look at. Before you do the data analysis, you have to take an online course. For this to be meaningful, you have to take an online course, which is 10 hours of YouTube lectures. So, you know, this is not trivial. And then they trying to sort of build another layer on top of that, of something that's a bit more simplified, still is data analysis. But again, what does this mean? That, you know, users start becoming acquainted with technical details, with maybe some of the linguistic features, with some of the conceptual issues. So yes, I think there's a way to do it, but it's the central question of science communication and science popularization. How do you bring this to a public and not lose what is really the core of the science? It's not a trivial matter. And I think, again, it also depends on the science. One of the things that Artur looks at, like I said, is bird watchers. Well, you know, he showed some diseases, how, you know, these bird watching portals can become even like a source of not quite entertaining, but, you know, ways for people to spend their free time and make it very enjoyable and, you know, really get a sense of what part of the science is. I can't see that really happening in LIGO easily, or without doing like a very, very strong simplification of what's happening here. In a way, I think, for example, Harry does a lot more of that, writing about it from the SCS side, than what the LIGO scientists could accomplish.
Okay, unless is there another question from, there's no more in the queue. Oh wait, actually, is that not right? That's not true.
There's one more in the queue.
You want to read it, Megan? I feel like I've been talking too much.
Okay. Do you think that scientists might become blinded to mistakes because of their own biases, or because they have worked with the data so much that they just cannot see it?
The short answer is yes, of course.
Okay.
But, you know, outsiders can also become biased. Well, I mean, one of the interesting things about LIGO, and I think just generally about any scientific community, is that, you know, the creation of knowledge goes beyond the individual. We're no longer, you know, the natural philosophers that just sit around and create knowledge out of our own heads or our own experiments. You know, this is the strength of scientific communities. And this is, going back to Merton, organized skepticism. It's not just you that, you know, is saying this is a fact. It's a lot of people going over your stuff, as happens in LIGO. And, you know, there are disagreements. Harry has a very good example. It's overused, but it's a very good example of you know, how to make these sort of arguments. And he says, like, look, how can we know that the moon landing was not faked? And if you ask a scientist, give you a bunch of reasons, technical reasons, and other people will say, well, you know, this is. It says, like, it's really a sociological reason. This happened right when the Cold War was at one of its highest points. Do you think that the Russians wouldn't have gone completely out of their way to prove that this was fake? Of course they would have. Yeah. So this is a sociological answer. I think that kind of, yeah, does that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. I mean, and then the follow-up is so what role could the public play in helping scientists see their biases? And I guess then the sort of follow-on to your question too is open data part of that role that the public or others may have in helping scientists see their biases?
You know, even as an open access fan, what I'm going to say may sound contradictory and controversial. If you ask me, I think the public can't help.
Yeah.
I mean, the public, as that homogeneous or highly heterogeneous, whatever, whichever way you want to see it, blob, to just come in and give a meaningful thing. They might. I don't think it's really that easy. If you say, well, again, I go back to that scale. Interested members of the public, well, maybe. And certainly in some issues, the more, the ethics of things, certainly, you can certainly see where the public opinion might. If that's the science, well, yeah, I think it's part of the science. So in there, yes, of course. Other places, I really do think it's a carefully constructed lie to say that the public can have that degree of influence on science. And I don't think it's actually very healthy to say.
I feel like that's a good place to end it.
I agree.
Very interesting and provocative argument. And yeah, fantastic talk. Thank you so much for taking the time to give it to us. So.
Digital applause.
Yeah. Thanks, Luis.
Thank you.
Thank you, Luis.
And thank you, people, for coming.
Absolutely. All right, with that, I will be closing this down. Encourage all y'all to come back in a couple of weeks for our next talk. Thank you so much, Luis, and we'll talk again.
All right.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.